Lately, many African countries have turned to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for financial help. But it often comes with conditions. Now, Russia and China are stepping up, offering their own financial deals. So, what does this mean for Africa? Is it finally breaking free from the IMF, or is there more to the story? In this video, we're going to look at how Russia and China are changing the game in Africa's finances and what it could mean for the future. Stay tuned to find out more. Africa's colonial history is a story of major change and ongoing struggles. When European countries like Britain, France, and Germany took control of Africa in the late 1800s and early 1900s, known as the Scramble for Africa, they divided the continent into territories, ignoring the local cultures, ethnic groups, and political systems that had been there for centuries. This created long-lasting problems, including conflicts that still affect many parts of Africa today. Economically, the main goal of colonization was to take Africa's resources to fuel European industries. Colonizers set up economies that depended on a single crop or resource, like cocoa in Ghana or rubber in the Congo. This made African countries vulnerable to drops in global prices, preventing them from developing more stable, diverse economies. Socially, European ways of education, government, and religion replaced local traditions and knowledge. Indigenous languages and cultures were often suppressed, leading to a loss of heritage and identity. Even though colonial powers left long ago, Africa has struggled to fully recover its rich cultural traditions. However, today, partnerships with countries like Russia and China suggest Africa might be taking steps toward regaining independence and becoming more self-sufficient. Russia's early relationship with Africa. Russia's involvement in Africa during the early 20th century was relatively minimal compared to that of European powers like Britain and France. While these nations had vast empires and colonial interests throughout Africa, Russia's geographical distance, lack of naval power, and absence of imperial ambitions meant that it did not pursue colonization on the continent. Instead, Russia's connections with Africa were more limited and focused on exploration, academic missions, and religious ties, rather than territorial expansion. Russian explorers were curious about Africa's landscapes and cultures, mainly aiming to learn about its geography, resources, and people. They weren't focused on controlling the land. The Russian Orthodox Church also had some connection with Africa, especially through its relationship with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which helped create a sense of spiritual bond. Even though Russia's influence in Africa wasn't as strong as other European countries, Russia's formal political and diplomatic engagement with Africa was limited, especially when compared to the more aggressive colonial policies of the time. One notable exception was the establishment of a consulate in Tangier, Morocco, in 1897. This diplomatic move allowed Russia to keep an eye on the activities of the European colonial powers in North Africa and gain a foothold in the region. However, Russia never pursued widespread colonization or imperial control over African territories, instead opting for a more cautious approach to its involvement on the continent. The Cold War and strategic alliances. The decolonization of Africa in the mid-20th century created a huge opportunity for the Soviet Union, as many African nations gained their independence from colonial powers. The USSR saw this as a chance to build strong relationships with these new nations. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union positioned itself as a key ally of African countries fighting for freedom. Moscow didn't just offer support out of kindness, though. It was a calculated move to gain influence and challenge Western powers, especially the United States, by supporting nations that opposed capitalism. One of the most significant examples of Soviet involvement was in Algeria. The USSR played a crucial role in supporting Algeria's National Liberation Front during its war for independence from France. This wasn't an isolated case. The Soviet Union also extended its help to other African liberation movements, such as those in Angola and Mozambique. They provided arms, military training, and much-needed resources to help these countries free themselves from colonial powers. Additionally, the African National Congress, ANC, in South Africa, which was fighting against apartheid, received support from the USSR during its battle for equality and justice. Ethiopia's situation was another example of Soviet support. After the Ethiopian Revolution in 1974, which overthrew Emperor Haile Selassie and brought a socialist government to power, the Soviet Union became deeply involved. Moscow provided Ethiopia with military aid and advisors, and even sent Cuban troops to assist in conflicts, such as the Ogaden War against Somalia. These actions showed that the Soviet Union was determined to have a major influence on Africa's political landscape, ensuring that its allies were equipped to stand against both colonial powers and Western-backed forces. Post-Cold War decline in engagement. When the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, Russia turned its attention inward, focusing on fixing its own problems. The country went through a lot of economic and political struggles as it tried to rebuild itself. Because of this, Russia reduced its international efforts, especially when it came to Africa. Embassies were shut down, trade with African countries decreased drastically, and military ties were almost completely forgotten. Back in 1985, Russia's trade with Africa had reached a peak of $5.9 billion, showing that there was a solid connection between the two. But by 1995, that number had dropped sharply to under $1 billion. African nations, now facing their own tough economic situations in the aftermath of the Cold War, started to seek help and new partnerships from other places. Western countries and global institutions like the IMF stepped in, offering financial support, but their policies often led to strict measures that hurt economic growth. Instead of improving the situation, many African countries found themselves facing even more hardship. In this time of uncertainty, new global players, particularly China, started to step in and offer a different kind of partnership. China's approach was more focused on trade and investment, which attracted many African nations looking for a way out of the financial struggles they were facing. China's willingness to build relationships without the same strict conditions set by Western institutions gave Africa an alternative path, and this began to change the dynamics of global influence in Africa. Russia's re-engagement in the 21st century. The 2000s marked a turning point for Russia as it started paying more attention to Africa once again. After years of limited engagement, Russia realized it was time to reclaim some of its past influence on the continent. To do this, Russia began forming strong military and economic partnerships with various African nations, showing its desire to strengthen its position and compete with other global powers. By 2024, Russia had already built military cooperation agreements with 43 different African countries. These agreements weren't just about defense deals, but involved various aspects like arms sales, military training programs, and the deployment of military advisors. A prime example of this growing influence can be seen in Equatorial Guinea, where Russian military instructors were sent to train elite guards who were responsible for protecting the presidency. This move signaled Russia's deepening influence in West Africa, a region that was previously more closely tied to European and American interests. On the economic front, Russia has poured a lot of investment into Africa, particularly in the mining and energy sectors. Russian companies have become increasingly involved in oil, gas, and mineral extraction projects, taking full advantage of Africa's vast natural resources. Although trade between Russia and Africa still doesn't compare to the trade volumes between China and Africa, or between Africa and the European Union. The growing partnership between the two indicates that Russia has a long-term plan to continue strengthening its economic ties with the continent. This strategy shows Russia's aim to compete with major global powers by leveraging Africa's resources, marking a new chapter in international relations that could reshape the continent's future. China's historical engagement with Africa. China's relationship with Africa began modestly in the early 20th century, primarily involving small-scale trade and labor migration under European colonial rule. However, The mid-20th century saw China actively supporting African liberation movements, aligning itself with the continent's anti-colonial aspirations. China provided military training, financial aid, and ideological support to movements in southern Africa, including Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Egypt was the first African country to establish diplomatic ties with China in 1956, setting the stage for deeper engagement across the continent. One of the most symbolic projects of early China-Africa relations was the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, TAZARA. Built in the 1970s, the railway connected Zambia's copper belt to Tanzania's port of Dar es Salaam, reducing reliance on routes controlled by white minority regimes in southern Africa, funded and constructed by China. The project highlighted Beijing's commitment to supporting Africa's economic independence. Modern China-Africa partnerships. Today, China is Africa's largest trading partner, with trade volumes reaching over $250 billion annually. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, China has invested heavily in African infrastructure, energy, and telecommunications. Projects such as the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway and the Mombasa-Nairobi Standard Gauge Railway have revolutionized connectivity and trade across the continent. China has also diversified its engagement, focusing on technology, healthcare, and green energy. During the 2024 FOCAC Summit, China pledged to create 1 million jobs in Africa, showcasing its long-term vision for the partnership. Africa in BRICS. Africa's role in global politics is growing, and its inclusion in the BRICS group shows just how important the continent has become. South Africa became part of BRICS in 2010, and more recently, Ethiopia and Egypt have joined, making Africa's presence in these global conversations even stronger. The goal of these partnerships is to create a world with more than one dominant power, a multipolar world, where African countries can have more independence and reduce their dependence on traditional Western institutions like the IMF. This shift is pushing African nations to look for more ways to control their own financial futures. Russia and China's growing partnerships with Africa represent a significant shift from the continent's colonial past. Both nations have moved beyond Cold War alliances to foster economic growth, military cooperation, and infrastructure development. As Africa strengthens its ties with BRICS nations, it could gain the tools to break free from the restrictive policies of institutions like the IMF, paving the way for a future of self-reliance and shared prosperity. So, what do you think? Will Russia and China's financial influence help Africa break free from the IMF? Or is it just another chapter in the same story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more updates on global politics and economics. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.